No pilot, no controls, nothing but 30,000 feet of empty sky and 100 terrified souls screaming behind her and Helen Carter, a flight attendant with zero flying experience, staring at a cockpit that might as well have been written in another language, knowing she had maybe 10 minutes before gravity made the decision for everyone. This is the story of how an ordinary woman became the only thing standing between life and a certain death plunge into the Atlantic Ocean. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. And please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Helen Carter woke up that Tuesday morning in her small Boston apartment with the same routine she had followed for 6 years. Coffee, toast, uniform pressed and ready. She was 32 years old, a senior flight attendant for Atlantic Airways, and she loved her job not because it was glamorous, but because it was predictable. She knew every safety procedure, every emergency protocol, every inch of the Boeing 737 she worked on. But there was one thing Helen had never done, never even considered doing: flying the plane itself. That was not her job. That was for the pilots, the trained professionals up front who made everything look easy. Flight 247 was scheduled to leave Boston at 11:15, heading to London Heathrow, 6 hours over the Atlantic. Helen checked in at the airport, went through her pre-flight routine with the crew, smiled at passengers as they boarded. There were 143 people on that plane. Families going on vacation, business travelers heading to meetings, an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary. Helen made her rounds, helped passengers with their bags, demonstrated the safety procedures she had shown 1,000 times before. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. Captain Richard Foster and First Officer James Webb were in the cockpit, experienced pilots with decades of flight hours between them. Helen had flown with Foster before, a calm and steady man who made everyone feel safe. As the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, Helen took her jump seat, buckled in, and prepared for takeoff. The engines roared, the plane lifted smoothly into the sky, and Boston disappeared beneath the clouds. Just another flight. Just another day. 30 minutes into the flight, Helen was in the galley preparing drinks for the passengers. The seatbelt sign had been turned off. People were settling in, some reading, some watching movies, some already asleep. The hum of the engines was steady and reassuring. Helen filled cups with juice and soda, arranged them on the cart, chatting with Maria, another flight attendant, about weekend plans. Then the call button from the cockpit lit up. 3 short flashes. That was unusual, but not alarming. Helen walked to the cockpit door, knocked twice, waited for the unlock signal. The door opened, and immediately Helen knew something was wrong. Captain Foster was slumped forward in his seat, his face pale and sweating. First Officer Webb was gripping his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow. Helen felt her heart stop for just a second before training kicked in. She called for Maria, called for any doctor on board, rushed into the cockpit. 2 passengers who were doctors came running. They worked on Foster first, checking his pulse, starting chest compressions. Heart attack, they said. Massive and sudden. Webb was conscious, but barely, also suffering cardiac symptoms, likely a heart attack triggered by stress or the same environmental factor. The doctors did everything they could, but within minutes, Foster was gone and Webb was fading fast, unable to speak, unable to move. Helen stood there in the cockpit doorway, watching the doctors work, watching the instruments blink and flash, watching the horizon tilt slightly because no one was holding the controls steady. The autopilot was on, keeping the plane level and on course, but autopilot could not land a plane. Autopilot could not navigate emergencies. Autopilot was just a temporary solution, and they were 300 miles from land, over the open Atlantic, with no pilot. The reality hit Helen like a physical force. There was no one else. The other flight attendants had no training. The passengers had no training. There were no off-duty pilots on board. The doctors had already checked. It was just her, standing in a cockpit, staring at 100 switches and screens and dials that controlled a 70-ton machine, hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour. Maria was on the radio, calling air traffic control, explaining the situation, her voice shaking. The response came back immediately. They needed to establish contact with someone in the cockpit. They needed someone to take the controls. Helen stepped forward, her legs feeling like they might give out, and sat down in the captain's seat. The doctors had moved Foster's body to the back, were still trying to stabilize Webb, but Helen knew he was not going to be able to help. She was alone. She put on the headset, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Air traffic control. Came through, a calm voice, a man named David, and he said the words that would stay with Helen forever. "You are going to fly this plane. We are going to help you, but you have to trust yourself. You have to stay calm." Helen wanted to scream that she could not do this, that she did not know how, that this was insane, but she looked back through the cockpit door and saw the faces of the passengers, some of them staring at her, some of them crying, all of them depending on her. She took a breath, steadied her voice, and said, "Okay." Next, image 6, David started talking her through the basics. The autopilot was handling most of the work, but they needed to redirect the plane to the nearest airport, which was Gander in Newfoundland, about 200 miles away. Helen had to input new coordinates into the flight management system. David told her which buttons to press, which screens to touch, speaking slowly and clearly. Helen's hands were still shaking, but she followed every instruction exactly. She found the keypad, entered the coordinates David gave her, double-checked everything. The plane began to turn, a slow banking motion that made her stomach drop, but it was working. They were heading toward land. But that was the easy part. The hard part was still coming. Landing. Helen had watched pilots land planes hundreds of times, had sat in jump seats during approach, had seen the choreography of switches and throttles and wheels. But watching was not the same as doing, not even close. David told her they were going to walk through every single step, that she was not alone, that pilots on the ground were already running simulations of the landing, figuring out the best approach. But Helen knew the truth. She was going to have to put this plane on the ground herself. Her hands on the controls. Her decisions. Her responsibility. The plane descended toward Gander, the Atlantic Ocean giving way to the rocky coast of Newfoundland. Helen could see land now, green and brown and solid, and it had never looked so beautiful. David talked her through the descent, telling her when to reduce speed, when to lower the landing gear, when to adjust the flaps. Every instruction was followed by Helen repeating it back, confirming, making sure she understood. The cockpit was filled with alarms now, warnings about altitude and speed and approach angle, but David told her to ignore them, to focus only on his voice. The runway appeared ahead, a thin strip of grey in the middle of the wilderness. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away. David told her to line up the nose of the plane with the center line of the runway, to keep her hands steady on the yoke, to trust the instruments. Helen gripped the controls, feeling the weight of the plane in her hands, feeling every vibration and shift. The ground was coming up fast, too fast, and Helen's instinct was to pull up, to climb, to get away from the earth that suddenly seemed so threatening. But David's voice was in her ear, calm and steady, telling her to hold course, to keep descending, to trust the process. The runway was right there, filling the windscreen, and Helen could see emergency vehicles lining both sides, fire trucks and ambulances, waiting. The plane's wheels were down, the flaps were extended, the speed was dropping. David counted down the altitude. 500 feet, 300 feet, 100 feet. Helen pulled back slightly on the yoke, felt the plane respond, felt the nose lift just a little. 50 feet, 20 feet, and then the wheels touched the runway. A jarring thump that rattled every bone in Helen's body, and the plane bounced once, hard, before settling down. Helen slammed on the brakes, exactly as David had instructed, felt the plane shudder and slow. The runway was racing past, the end coming up fast, but the plane was slowing, and then it stopped. Right there on the runway. Stopped. Safe. Helen sat there for a moment, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The cockpit was silent, except for the alarms still blaring. Then she heard it, cheering, screaming, crying. The passengers were cheering. And Maria was on the intercom, her voice breaking with emotion, telling everyone they were safe. They were on the ground. They were alive. The emergency crews surrounded the plane immediately. Paramedics boarded, took Webb away on a stretcher, treated passengers for shock. Helen was escorted off the plane by officials, her legs barely working, her mind still stuck in that cockpit. The passengers lined up to thank her, to hug her, to cry on her shoulder. The elderly couple who was celebrating their anniversary held her hands and told her she was a hero. A young mother with 2 children kissed her cheek and whispered thank you over and over. Helen could barely speak, could barely breathe. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly, she had done it. The investigation later revealed that Foster and Webb had both suffered heart attacks, caused by a rare reaction to contaminated air in the cockpit, a faulty valve that had leaked fumes into the cabin pressurization system. It was a 1 in a million malfunction, something that should never have happened. But it did. And Helen Carter, a flight attendant with no pilot training, had saved 143 lives. The story made headlines around the world. Helen was interviewed on every major news network, was given awards and commendations, was offered book deals and movie rights. But Helen did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had been thrown into an impossible situation and had somehow survived. She went back to work 2 months later, back to being a flight attendant, back to the routine she loved. But something had changed. She was not afraid anymore. Not of flying, not of emergencies, not of the impossible, because she had faced the impossible and she had won. Helen Carter proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when everything is on the line. She proved that training and preparation matter, but so does courage and determination. She proved that sometimes the person who saves you is not the person you expect. It is the person who refuses to give up, who keeps going even when every instinct says to quit. Helen never wanted to be a hero, never wanted the spotlight, but she became something more important. She became proof that we are all stronger than we think, that we are all capable of more than we know. And every time she boards a plane now, every time she walks down that aisle and smiles at passengers, she carries with her the knowledge that she did the impossible once, and if she had to, she could do it again. That is the power of the human spirit. That is what happens when someone refuses to let fear win. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this.